Let's imagine that there are two tribes living in a valley during the ancient hunter-gatherer days. Tribe Blue hunts elk to survive and considers the buffalo to be sacred, while Tribe Red hunts buffalo to survive and considers elk to be sacred. One day, Tribe Blue accuses Tribe Red of being evil, heretical, no good, very big, bad, meaning, literally heat lures for killing their sacred buffalo, and declares war. The elder of Tribe Red realizes that war over a cultural difference like this will just result in meaningless bloodshed, so he tries to reason with them. So he points out that Tribe Blue does the same thing to their sacred elk, and that it's therefore hypocritical for Tribe Blue to try and force their beliefs onto others when they're doing the same thing. The elder then proposes a compromise. Elk and buffalo on one side of the river between the two tribes will be deemed to be sacred, while on the other side, the opposing animals are not. By using the river to draw property lines, the tribes can continue to coexist in the valley without going at each other's throats due to their differing beliefs. Rather than listening to reason, Tribe Blue instead raises their spears and screams, "Whataboutism!" If you are familiar at all with online political discourse, you have probably come across this word before as a sort of catch-all retort. And the two sides I see of it are, first, people claiming it's just a way for hypocrites to avoid being called out on their hypocrisy, and the second side is people claiming that whataboutism is a variant of the quoque fallacy. So, who's right? Well, the answer I've found is, strangely, kind of both, but mostly it's the first crowd that is correct. Most of the time you see someone say, "whataboutism," they seem to believe it's some kind of magic word that excuses the contradictions in their beliefs. So when you look up whataboutism on Wikipedia, which despite being biased is pretty reliable for mainstream bandwagon opinions like this, it claims that it's a variant of the quoque logical fallacy, which attempts to discredit an opponent's position by charging hypocrisy without directly refuting or disproving the argument. So immediately there's one large problem here. When it comes to issues of philosophy and ethics, pointing out hypocrisy can in fact by itself be a pretty solid way to discredit the argument. When a person's ethical model includes something along the lines of X is morally good for me but not for thee, this is generally indicative of an inconsistent, dishonest, and subjective ethical model that is therefore not deserving of any serious consideration. And while quoques don't disprove the main point of an argument, they can bring a valid point on its own that is relevant to the context. This is because quoques are an informal fallacy rather than a formal one. The difference between the two is that formal fallacies commit serious reasoning errors that are always wrong, such as if A then B, B therefore A. Informal fallacies, however, generally fail to disprove the arguments they intend to disprove, but they can prove a different point that, depending on context, effectively renders the argument moot. For instance, what the elder of Tribe Red had to say. While he did not disprove the accusation that his tribe was indeed killing the Blues' sacred buffalo, he did provide a very rational alternative to war, while also proving that Tribe Blue didn't really have any moral high ground to stand on, since they effectively were doing the same thing. So while he did not prove his tribe's innocence, he absolutely did prove that Tribe Blue is being unreasonable and that there is a better solution to their problem. Or another example, in my video I did about the Gravel Institute, I did a response to their take on cancel culture and refuted their video by pointing out that they were committing a quoque fallacy. They were basically saying that today's leftist cancel culture is okay because Republican theocrats also did it in the past. But I didn't just simply say, oh, this is a quoque and leave it at that. I also conceded that it is fairly cringe when right-leaning theocrats pull their satanic panic nuttery on the Dungeons & Dragons many years ago. The thing is, if you want to have a worldview that is based, and not just be another clueless soy cuck who walks around with contradictory ideas bouncing around inside their head, acknowledging hypocrisy and contradictions in one's beliefs is kind of important. So while you do it too is in fact a quoque and thus doesn't automatically refute the subject matter at hand, if you can't come up with a justification for why it's good for me but bad for thee, then on a philosophical level it causes serious contradictions that brings the whole thing into question. However, that's just one side to the story of whataboutism. Looking into the history a bit further, we run into a dishonest tactic employed by Soviet Russia, where the US would criticize the Soviets over things like censorship and imprisonment of dissidents, to which the Soviets would then reply with something along the lines of, "What about your lynching of Negroes?" which became a kind of classic line to describe Soviet propaganda. This actually is a fallacious use of whataboutism, but there's a good reason for that. What Soviets was doing with their "and you lynched Negroes" line wasn't just a quoque, but it was also a red herring. The Soviets weren't just pointing fingers when they did this, but it was a deliberate attempt to change the subject altogether. This is when you could definitely make the argument that whataboutism is a dishonest tactic, but again, only when it's also in the context of a red herring. What you will often see instead in online discussions is that people like to scream "whataboutism" in cases where the subject isn't really being changed at all. The most common case of this dishonesty you might notice is when a member of a political party will claim that a leader of the opposing political party is a fascist, and they base this accusation on reasons that could just as easily be applied to the leader of their own party. When someone points out their hypocrisy, rather than acknowledging the contradiction and double standards they're holding, they will instead just accuse the person who called out said hypocrisy of whataboutism. In this manner, the accusation of whataboutism is used more of a cop-out for hypocrites to avoid acknowledging the reality that they are guilty of holding double standards. Rarely ever do you see this word being used against genuine cases of combining two quoque with red herrings. Plus, in this particular case, it's completely ignoring the point. What if the person pointing out the hypocrisy doesn't believe that either politician is a fascist, and is merely trying to get the other person to realize that their reasoning doesn't make sense by trying to show them how their reasoning could just as easily be applied to someone they like? At that point, it's not even a two quoque anymore either. In conclusion, whataboutism is one of those arguments that has both a fallacious form and a valid form. When the purpose of the whataboutery is to completely change the subject, then it's generally fallacious and not an honest method. But when it's being used for the purpose of exposing a "for me but not for thee" style of reason, or other contradictions, which usually that's the case, whataboutism actually brings a valid point. And people who simply say "that's whataboutism" to dodge being called out on their inconsistencies while failing to address the context of the conversation are just not arguing in good faith. So when you see someone cry "whataboutism," the best response is just ask them to contextualize what they specifically mean by that, and if they can't do it, they're probably full of shit. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed the video, feel free to like, sub, and all that. Till next time.